The Whitlock property stood at the end of a dirt road that had long surrendered to weeds. Once called Whitlock Glen, the estate had become a rumor with chipped shutters, a place teenagers dared each other to touch after sunset. Now it belonged to no one. Birds avoided its rafters, roots had crept under its foundation, lifting parts of the house like skeletal fingers from beneath. The auctioneer didn't step inside. He simply posted the lot on a state listing, noting its historical significance and extreme disrepair. A contractor bought it sight unseen, a plan to flip and resell. But plans didn't survive what the house had protected. The crew arrived in the calm of October. The morning light cut through thinning leaves like surgical blades, clean and indifferent. From the outside, it was just another rotted Victorian relic, 3 stories of decay. Inside, the air held an unnatural weight. Not mold, not age, but something still and watching. The floorboards gave easily, revealing earth untouched in decades. As they cleared debris from the parlor, a worker's crowbar struck something not wood. Beneath a layer of dust and warped oak was iron, not a pipe but a square slab, bolted flat, embedded in the foundation. The seal had no keyhole, no markings, just cold black metal that hummed faintly if you pressed your ear to it. Not with sound, but with vibration. It wasn't on any blueprint, it shouldn't have been there, and yet it waited as though the house had been guarding it. A historian was called to verify, and she brought an archaeologist. What they uncovered was worse than a crime scene. It was a monument to something unspeakable. Days passed before they opened the seal. When the bolts were removed, 24 of them fused with corrosion, the air beneath rushed upward like breath held too long, dry but tainted. Not rot, not death, something older. The stairwell beneath was tight and steep, its walls lined with white tiles the color of old teeth. At the bottom, a second door, steel this time, held with 3 crossbars and a rusted wheel lock. It hadn't been opened in decades, maybe longer. Behind it, darkness clung like a memory that didn't want to be remembered. Officials called it a hidden cellar, but it was no cellar. It was too deep, too engineered. It had ventilation shafts, drainage lines, and what looked like insulated walls, the kind used in hospitals or morgues. Still, no one could explain the chains bolted to the floor in the center of the first chamber. Nor the drain, a wide iron mouth with reddish mineral stains spiraling inward like a slow whirlpool. There was no furniture, no light fixtures, no signs of habitation. Just a room built to contain something, or someone. The news didn't report much. Historic find beneath 1800s home, they wrote, omitting the unease every investigator felt. Some refused to go down a second time. Others didn't speak at all after returning. A few quit altogether. From the edge of the property, the trees bent oddly as if leaning away. One officer noted that his flashlight dimmed every time he neared the second stairwell, but batteries always tested fine. He stopped going back. The town of Cider Hollow, once proud of its preserved architecture, quietly removed the house from its registry. No one came forward to claim relation to the Whitlocks. The Historical Society went silent. Records began to vanish. But something had been opened. Something that had waited beneath the floorboards, not just to be found, but to be remembered. This was no mere architectural oddity. It was a door built for forgetting. And now it had been disturbed. The year was 1918, and Cider Hollow had been spared the worst of the world's pain. The war in Europe had stolen sons, but its violence never touched the soil. The influenza outbreak had claimed 6 lives, mostly the elderly, and the rest of the town healed quickly, wrapped in the fog of rural stillness. So when Dr. Horace Whitlock arrived with his younger sister Miriam in tow, both dressed in modest black and trailing the air of private grief, the townspeople opened their doors without question. Horace said their parents had died of the fever weeks apart. He said the city had become unbearable. They were looking to start again, away from the noise and rot. Horace was handsome in the way old photographs forget. Narrow face, fine features, clear blue eyes that didn't blink more than they needed to. He spoke softly but precisely, always answering just enough to satisfy. He brought with him crates of polished instruments and tall shelves of medical books, and within weeks had converted the east wing of the house into a small countryside clinic. People were impressed. Some were suspicious. New doctors weren't always trusted. But Horace charged nothing for the poor. He delivered 2 babies within his first month and set a man's fractured leg with surgical skill. When the mayor's wife fainted in church, it was Horace who revived her. Miriam rarely left the house. She was small, ghost-pale, and moved like someone unsure they belonged to their own skin. When she did walk into town, it was always behind her brother, hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes lowered. She smiled without showing teeth and nodded without speaking. Some whispered she wasn't right in the head, others pitied her. But everyone agreed she looked like a girl who had seen too much death too early. What no one noticed was the way she flinched when Horace touched her shoulder, the tension that ran through her spine like a pulled thread. They called it grief. They called it closeness. They never called it what it truly was. The Whitlocks settled in quickly. Horace became known for his strange hours, often working late into the night, candles burning well past midnight. Locals assumed it was dedication, when strange chemical smells began to waft from the lower windows. He explained them as antiseptics. When one of the town's orphans came down with a seizure, Horace took the child in for observation. The boy was returned a week later, quieter than before, unable to recall anything after the first night. He would later refuse to enter any cellar again, even his own. But his parents chalked it up to fevered dreams and were grateful to have him back at all. Horace was respected, then trusted, then woven into the fabric of the town. He kept to himself unless needed, never asked for favors, and always delivered when he was called. His knowledge was impressive. He read journals most doctors hadn't heard of. He had treatments no one else could access. He claimed to have studied under great minds in Vienna, though no one could find their names in the records. His charm wasn't warm. It was efficient, precise. Like a scalpel drawn across soft flesh with just the right pressure. What few people knew was that Horace had requested the property specifically. In letters to the land office, he noted the house's isolation, its deep foundation, and proximity to mineral-rich soil. He asked whether the cellar had been reinforced and whether the surrounding trees grew close enough to muffle sound. These weren't the questions of a grieving man. They were the requirements of someone preparing a place for something that would not be spoken of in daylight. Something that would take root and grow downward. By winter, the Whitlocks were no longer strangers. They were just the quiet doctor and his shy sister who lit no Christmas lights and never hosted guests. They brought fresh bread to the widow next door and stitched wounds with gentler hands than anyone else in town. The snow covered their roof like any other, and the world above moved on. But beneath the floorboards, beneath the carefully swept tiles and quiet hallways, the first chamber had already been carved. The blueprints were never filed, the tools were never seen, and no one inside her hollow thought to ask why the East Wing's windows never let out light, no matter how late Horace worked. At first it was just a curiosity, the kind of soft murmur that passes harmlessly between teacups and market stalls. Horace Whitlock, the town's miracle doctor, had begun accepting patients for long-term care, but only certain ones. The fevers, the tumors, the ailments of the flesh he continued to treat in public view. But when it came to the ones who screamed without wounds, who trembled without cold, who stared at walls and whispered names no one knew, those he took into the East Wing. No one saw them again. Horace said it was a mercy. He said their families were too fragile to witness the process. He said minds could rot like bodies if not cut and cauterized. He called it experimental psychiatry, a new frontier of healing. And because he spoke with confidence, because his smile never cracked, the town nodded and obeyed. It began with the widow's son. He had returned from the war with eyes that wouldn't close and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Horace visited the home, observed him for hours, then offered to take him in for a series of specialized treatments. The boy was driven to the Whitlock estate in the back of a covered wagon, mumbling to himself in German, a language he never knew before the trenches. Days passed, then weeks. A letter arrived by post, typed in rigid lines claiming the patient had shown progress and would be relocated to a sanitarium in upstate New York for further recovery. The family never saw him again. When they inquired, Horace said the transfer was urgent, done through medical channels they wouldn't understand. The mother, weak with her own grief, didn't push further. Another followed, a girl of 15 who claimed she could hear the thoughts of animals. Her father beat her for speaking nonsense, then brought her to Horace in desperation. She was pale, trembling, her mouth moving faster than her voice. Horace said her condition was rare but treatable. She disappeared into the East Wing the same day. A month later, a similar letter arrived. Vague, clinical, oddly detached. It included phrases like restorative silence and intensive cleansing of perception. When her mother demanded to see her, Horace apologized. He said the girl had relapsed violently and was no longer in his care. The family eventually moved away. No one asked where she went. It became a pattern, one cloaked in professionalism and stamped with medical authority. The letters always used the same phrases: departure for advanced care, unpredictable neural response, termination of family correspondence due to ethical safeguards. Some even included diagrams, but never of the patient. Only charts, graphs, or symbols that looked medical enough to pacify. The pages smelled faintly of formalin, but no one noticed. Miriam was seen more often now, though still silent. She delivered the letters by hand on occasion, her eyes distant, her hands gloved even in summer. She said little, just that Horace was making great progress with his research. Her skin had grown translucent, her posture more brittle, as if carrying a weight no one could see. Sometimes her shoes had traces of what looked like clay. the red kind found near riverbeds, not common in Cider Hollow. No one thought to ask where she'd been walking. By the end of that winter, 4 patients had vanished under Horace's care. Their families, spaced far enough apart, never compared notes. And those who did wonder kept their thoughts quiet. After all, Horace had saved so many others. He'd brought down fevers, stitched open bellies, pulled children back from death. He was their doctor. He had a clinic. He had credentials. And if a few strange cases slipped through the cracks, well, that was just medicine. It was the price of progress. But beneath the floorboards of the East Wing there were no beds. There were no transfers. There were no patients being healed. Only silence. Only layers of earth slowly soaking what could not be spoken aloud. Miriam had once moved like she was afraid of waking something. Her steps were soft, her voice smaller still, and her gaze rarely met another's for more than a second. In the beginning, she wore long skirts with modest blouses and always kept her gloves on, even when she peeled apples in the garden. There was something bird-like about her, cautious, fragile, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting the wind to whisper her name in warning. But by the end of that first year in Cider Hollow, that softness had begun to thin. She stopped visiting the market entirely. She didn't wave from the window anymore. Her body remained, but the person inside it had started to retreat. It began slowly. Her eyes dimmed not with age or illness, but like lamps turned down by another's hand. Her shoulders curled inward as if cradling secrets she could no longer carry. She no longer walked beside Horace, but behind him. Not like a sister, but like an assistant. She flinched less when he gave her orders. She spoke less with each season until her words became single syllables, then nods, then nothing. She started wearing only gray. Neighbors who saw her said she looked like a shadow in human shape. What troubled some, though most didn't say it aloud, was what she had started doing after sunset. People living closest to the Whitlocks began to notice the flicker of lantern light moving through the house long after midnight. Miriam was seen pulling heavy crates from a storage shed and hauling them to the cellar door, her thin frame straining with each load. The crates made no sound when moved, no clatter, no shifting weight. Just the low scrape of wood over dirt. One man claimed to see her carrying something that looked like butcher's paper soaked through with red, but he never brought it up again, and no one pressed him. There were days when she walked through town and stared at things without seeing them. She'd stand outside the chapel, gazing at the steeple for 20 minutes without moving. Or she'd sit at the edge of the well in total stillness, her hands folded in her lap like someone waiting to be scolded. She never responded when called. Her skin had gone pale, almost waxy, and her once blonde hair hung dull and straight as straw. Some wondered if she was ill, but Horace told them she was simply overworked, fragile by nature. He said the human mind bends in strange ways when carrying grief. But it wasn't grief anymore. It was something else, a surrender. Miriam wasn't breaking. She was being hollowed, shaped. Her emotions scraped clean like the inside of a jar, leaving just enough left to fill with something else. Something colder. She was still Miriam in body and name, but she had stopped blinking when people spoke to her, and she had stopped shaking when she went into the cellar alone. When the iron door was pried open decades later, they found a room that no one could have imagined. And yet it had been waiting all along, sealed in darkness like a lung held tight without air. The walls were tiled in bone-colored ceramic, not cracked, not stained, but polished to a disturbing shine, as if someone had wiped them clean too many times. In the center stood a single table, metal and narrow, with restraints rusted in place. But it wasn't the table that stopped the first responders in their tracks. It was the shelves, dozens of them, lined with identical glass jars, each perfectly spaced, each filled with a murky amber fluid that clung to the curves like molasses, and inside each one, suspended with delicate wire, was a human vocal cord. Some were intact, preserved with precision. Others bore surgical modifications. Stitches sewn with fine silk, forming loops and ridges, and in several cases symbols that didn't appear in any known language. But tucked beneath each jar was a slip of brittle paper curled with time. The handwriting was neat, and everyone was labeled with a verse, not a name, not a date, but scripture. Psalms, Corinthians, Exodus, even fragments of Revelations. The ink had faded, but the intent had not. This was not documentation. This was doctrine. Horace had written extensively in his journals, though few pages survived the rot, about a theory he called vocal purity. He believed that the human voice was the closest expression of the soul's architecture, that within the sound of a scream or a prayer or a confession, there lived evidence of moral sickness or divine worth. He claimed the voice could carry rot, and that certain frequencies, the wails of the broken, the shrieks of the insane, the final cries of the unrepentant, needed to be removed from the world entirely. He believed that by extracting the vocal cords, preserving them in silence, and marking them with symbols of sacred correction, he was not killing the sinner. He was cleansing the sin itself. It was not science. It was liturgy disguised as surgery. The victims were chosen not for their illnesses, but for the sounds they made in despair, the way their voices cracked or trembled. Horace wrote that those who screamed too much were unripened, while those who whispered through pain were pure and close to grace. His recordings, if they ever existed, were never found. But the jars were real. Their weight, their shape, their silence. They told the truth louder than any words could. The anatomical choir, as the investigators later called it, had not sung a single note, but it had been arranged like music. Rows upon rows of mutilated sound, bottled and labeled as if part of some holy experiment. And as the room was emptied, the jars removed, no one could shake the feeling that the cords were still vibrating, not from sound, but from the memory of what had been taken. The journals were found locked in a copper-lined drawer beneath the second sub-level, wrapped in oilcloth and buried under surgical tarps that still smelled faintly of iron and mold. The paper had warped with time, but the ink remained legible, untouched by water or rot, as if the words themselves had resisted decay. What they revealed was not a record of treatment, but the anatomy of belief. A system of thought built not on medicine or ethics, but on ritualized cruelty disguised as redemption. Horace Whitlock had not considered himself a doctor in the traditional sense. He believed himself a kind of vessel, a conductor for pain ordained by suffering to pass judgment through flesh. His theory, which he called the doctrine of pain transfer, was rooted in the belief that trauma held energy, Not metaphorical energy, but a measurable, transferable force that could be drawn from the nerves of one body and pushed into another. He wrote that pain, when concentrated and precisely inflicted, could strip a soul of its corruption. But he did not stop there. He argued that this pain could be absorbed by proxy, that by using one body to endure the agony, another body could be cleansed of sin, illness, or spiritual rot. It was not healing, it was punishment redistributed. He believed it to be merciful. The journals included diagrams, crude drawings of human forms with red ink marking nerve clusters, pressure points, and incisions designed to open the channels. He described a technique he called sympathetic inversion, where a bound subject was tortured with methodical precision while another, often unconscious, was placed nearby in silence, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes gagged. The pain inflicted on one was meant to ripple outward, like blood in water toward the other. If the ritual was done correctly, Horace claimed the second body would twitch, sweat, cry out, not in injury but in release, in purification. He saw it as proof. The tortures themselves were never random. They were selected based on the sin he believed resided in the afflicted. For liars, he split the tongue and stitched it back with horsehair. For those with lustful thoughts, he used heat, not fire, but boiling cloth pressed to the thighs and stomach in symmetrical intervals. For the violent, he shattered fingers with rods and set them improperly, forcing the body to live with imbalance. But the most horrifying were the ones he labeled vessels. These were not guilty, at least not in his writing. These were the ones chosen to carry the pain for others. He never named them. He called them clean slates. Miriam, though never mentioned directly, was referenced in scattered notes, always as she who prepares. Her tasks were listed coldly. Disinfect the benches, drain the basin, extract tooth fragments before dawn. There was no emotion in his instructions, just process. She was part of the machinery now, a cog that did not need to understand the engine it turned. In his world, questions were decay. Stillness was purity. Horace believed pain could make the world holy. He believed that if he perfected the method, if the ratio of suffering to cleansing was exact, he could cure anything. Guilt, madness, desire. He wrote that pain was the oldest language, the first prayer ever spoken, and by translating it correctly, he could bring about a kind of sacred silence, not peace, not forgiveness, just a final, holy quiet where nothing impure could speak again. When the second steel door was finally breached, the air behind it rolled out thick and wet, like the breath of something that should have died long ago but didn't. The floor was black stone, cold to the touch and stained with patterns no one could quite explain. Not from mold or water damage, but from time itself. There were no lights overhead, only the long dead remnants of wiring coiled like veins along the walls. Flashlights scanned across the space, illuminating what appeared to be crude hospital beds, 12 of them, built not from hospital-grade steel but from mismatched materials, wood and pipe and rusted frame, each with restraints still buckled shut. In each bed was a body, still living. The first didn't respond when the officers called out. His skin was grayish, sunken around the edges, stretched too thin across bone. A slow, steady rise of the chest was the only proof of life. Tubes snaked from his arms and neck. IV lines fed from hanging bags that had long congealed. The fluid inside was no longer clear. Some bags had crystallized entirely. Yet the man breathed, slowly, shallow. His eyes had been removed, not sloppily but with surgical precision, the sockets sealed with waxy gauze that had fused into the skin. His ears were packed with a dark resin solid as stone. His mouth was stitched shut in tiny symmetrical loops, as if someone had tried to silence him in the most permanent, reverent way possible. Each bed held a variation of the same horror. 12 bodies, all in differing states of mutilated preservation. Some were missing tongues, others entire limbs. All had been stripped of one or more senses: sight, sound, speech, sometimes touch. The removal was methodical. There were no signs of infection, no careless wounds. These weren't injuries, they were procedures. The victims had not been left to die. They had been maintained, sustained, preserved just above death, suspended in a state where consciousness could not rest and the body could not scream. Notes pinned above each bed gave no names, only numbers and phrases. Subject 4. Deprivation complete. Subject 7. Interrupted during Phase 4. Visual breach. Subject 10. Failed inversion, retained somatic twitch. Most chilling of all was the designation carved into the stone above the entire row. The phrase etched in Latin, translated loosely as, "Those who carried the pain forward." They were not listed as patients, not even as experiments. Horace had called them instruments. According to further journal entries, the 12 were the culmination of his doctrine, the final attempt to build a vessel capable of holding more pain than any natural body should withstand. Each subject had been slowly hollowed, their sensory functions removed in intervals, each mutilation followed by carefully timed cleansing rituals designed to erase memory, self, and identity. The goal was not death, it was transformation. He believed that by silencing every point of external input, he could create a human shell through which the pain of others could be funneled indefinitely, like an emotional sponge. Horace detailed his work with cold satisfaction. He noted the patterns in breath after the loss of vision. He calculated nerve responses after the removal of hearing. He studied how the soul clung to remnants of self even after vocal cords had been dissected and brain matter slightly burned to reduce memory recall. He believed that some part of consciousness remained, flickering like heat from dying coals, and that this ember could be repurposed, redirected, harvested. What horrified investigators most was not just the bodies or the condition they were in, but the quiet. None of the 12 made a sound. No cries, no moans. Only the occasional spasm, the twitch of a limb or a shudder of breath. Some blinked even with no eyes. One had tears rolling down scarred cheeks, though it was unclear whether from reflex or something deeper, something aware. These were not patients. They were not survivors. They were ingredients. Slowly stripped of humanity, one sense at a time, until nothing remained but the raw, enduring core of suffering. And Horace Whitlock had called that core divine. Beneath the second sublevel, past the row of the 12, there was another door. Smaller, arched, reinforced with concrete and sealed with iron crossbars, as though whoever built it feared not what might enter, but what must never leave. The air behind it was heavier, staler, with a smell not entirely of rot, but of something long enclosed that should not have been allowed to continue. What lay beyond wasn't a surgical chamber, it wasn't a lab or a morgue. It was a performance hall designed by a mind that no longer saw people as people. The walls were padded thick with soundproofing materials, not just cloth or insulation, but slabs of processed cork layered with thick oils that had dried to a leathery sheen. The ceiling was lined with curves, almost cathedral-like, meant to bounce and shape sound. But no music ever echoed here, not the way ordinary people understood it. On the far side of the room, built into the wall, was a structure that no one could name at first. It looked like a pipe organ, though it had no pipes. It had strings, tubes, levers, and pieces that were not mechanical at all. Jawbones, knuckles, spinal segments fitted like keys. Rows of tendon were stretched and dried into taut cords, some of them still reddish, some turned yellow with age. They weren't decorations. They were functional. The files found nearby confirmed what no one wanted to admit. Horace had constructed an instrument, hand-built, designed over years, maybe decades, made not from wood or brass, but from harvested human anatomy. He called it the body organ. It required precise input. It could not be played with fingers alone. It required weight, fluid, heat. The instructions were handwritten in obsessive detail, noting temperature ranges of tissue, the timing of nerve responsiveness, and the necessary state of anguish to evoke certain frequencies. In one journal entry, he wrote of a symphony of transcendence that could only be summoned through suffering arranged in sequence. He described a ritual in which a subject, post-surgery but still conscious, was connected via clamps and wires to the organ itself. The tendons acted as strings. The vocal cords harvested from previous victims were dried and fitted into mouthpiece chambers where airflow and tension could mimic the sound of screams. But they were not screams, not as the world knew them. They were soundscapes of processed agony, bent, filtered, tuned. Horace believed each frequency corresponded to spiritual states. He had mapped them crudely. Pain at the edge of death, pain after the first betrayal, pain stripped of memory. One of the most detailed diagrams included a section labeled "Ascending Through Harmonics." It outlined a sequence of procedures, incisions, nerve pinches, bone shavings, each tied to a specific sound. The organ, when played alongside a living victim's induced responses, would produce what he called the gate tone. He believed this sound had the power to unlock what lay behind human awareness, to lift the soul for a brief instant above its cage. He wrote that in one moment, just once, he had reached it. He described hearing something answer back. The room had other instruments too, small devices like wind chimes made of teeth and metal wire, percussion drums stretched with human skin, bowls designed to catch and amplify whimpers. Each had its place. Some were marked with chalk outlines on the floor, suggesting a strict placement of performers, though none had ever been willing participants. Victims were strapped in, mutilated with precision, and used for their resonance. Their responses weren't side effects. They were the notes. The bloodstains on the floor were oddly shaped, circular pools with delicate splash patterns, suggesting not frenzied violence but repeated ritual. Cleaning supplies were stored neatly in a back cabinet. The tools were sharpened. The syringes were labeled. Every component had been sanitized, cataloged, preserved. This wasn't madness. It was devotion. In one final set of pages, Horace wrote of the silence. He believed that if he could play the full sequence with perfect timing, the noise of the world, the chaos, the hunger, the sin, would cease. Not for everyone, just within him. He described it as a full-body stillness, a peace so deep it vibrated in reverse. He believed he was close. The last date on the journal was written with a shaky hand. He claimed he was ready to sacrifice the final vessel. Subject 12, and that this would be the final act. But no record confirms he ever reached that final note. The organ was intact but unused when found. The surgical platforms were ready, the tubes clean, the instructions set beside the station like a hymn sheet. The last victim was alive, but just barely. Whether the silence ever came for Horace is unknown. What is known is that the room remained sealed after the police inspection. No one was allowed back in, not because it was a crime scene, but because the sounds, those frequencies, still hung in the air, like echoes that didn't fade, like music that refused to end. They found it beneath the black tile in the far corner of the music chamber, where a small panel clicked underfoot with a sound too deliberate to be accidental. Beneath it, in a velvet-lined cavity sealed with wax, was a cylinder of hardened resin wrapped in yellowing paper and labeled with a single phrase in delicate handwriting: "To be heard only by healers." The device to play it had nearly rotted, but the wax cylinder itself had endured. When finally played through a salvaged phonograph days later, it revealed the voice no one had heard in over 70 years. Calm, patient, careful. The voice of Horace Whitlock, speaking not in remorse but in instruction. He began with a greeting to the physician of the future, congratulating the listener for having found the chamber and survived the path it demanded. His tone was formal, as if delivering a lecture in some warped institution, one built on torment and silence. He did not call it a crime scene. He called it the hospital beneath. He said what lay below was not madness but progress, medicine not for the body but for the soul in collapse. He spoke of the failures of modern healing, of bandaging symptoms instead of extracting sickness. He spoke of the human spirit as a reservoir of darkness and how only pain could draw that darkness out like poison from a wound. In chilling detail, he described what he called the harvest of obedience, the method by which he reshaped his sister Miriam into what he called a pure extension of will. He explained how obedience was not demanded but instilled slowly, through daily rituals of deprivation, fractured sleep, and carefully timed affection. He likened it to tuning an instrument. At first resistance, then resignation, then reflexive compliance. He described her as his first successful patient, the only one to survive full recalibration of identity. Not as a sibling, as a tool. He claimed she had been lost to the world long before he began. He had only given her purpose. There was no mention of guilt. No apology, only pride. He spoke of the 12 not as victims, but as vessels that proved the capacity of the human nervous system to adapt to divine strain. He claimed their endurance was evidence that the soul was not as fragile as people believed. He called their silence a kind of music. He claimed his organ was not an invention but a discovery, a way to listen to the soul through the distortion of pain. He believed history would thank him. The final lines of the recording were perhaps the most disturbing. He said that if the hospital had been found, it was because the world was once again ready to suffer for truth. He said that pain, if properly curated, could guide the next era of medicine. He did not fear being judged. He feared being forgotten. And in that voice, calm, smiling, rotted only by time, was not horror. It was something colder. Legacy. Beneath a floorboard in the narrow room above the east wing, wedged between the wall slats behind a broken mirror, a small cloth bundle was discovered. Yellowed linen tied with hair instead of string, and inside it a diary no larger than a prayer book. The cover was soft leather, peeled at the corners, and its pages were stained by time, by tears, and by something darker that had dried to the consistency of ink. It was Miriam's hand, sharp, trembling strokes that grew fainter toward the end. The entries were scattered across months, perhaps years, written not for memory but as confession, as a slow unraveling of what remained of the person she once was. In the early pages, she pleaded with herself to believe Horace was helping people. She wrote of the long nights she spent cleaning his tools, scrubbing the stone floor until her knuckles split and trying not to listen to the sounds behind the sealed door. She tried to make sense of the pain, to believe it served some higher purpose. But the language shifted quickly. She stopped referring to the victims as patients. She called them the quiet ones and sometimes the still breathers. She described their faces not with cruelty, with apology. One page, pressed between others as if she had tried to hide it even from herself, detailed the night she crushed powdered aconite into Horace's tea. She had measured carefully, stirred slowly, and waited. But he never drank it. He had handed the cup to her with a soft smile, told her he brewed it for her nerves. She wrote that she drank it without protest, that she vomited for hours, that he never asked what had happened, that he never mentioned the tea again. After that, she stopped looking for a way out. Her final entries were skeletal, thin thoughts strung together like loose threads. She no longer described events. She counted rib bones, listed the number of times the screaming started before dawn. She began referring to herself in the third person. She wrote that the smell of formaldehyde clung to her even in sleep, that she had stopped dreaming, that her reflection no longer looked away when she stared too long. In her last week, the entries became ritualistic. She wrote the same sentence over and over. The vessel must be emptied before it can be used, sometimes in ink, sometimes in blood. The final page was dated with no year. It was the only page where the words were written in steady lines. She described lying on the floor, refusing food, believing that her body had become too corrupted to allow further use. She wrote that the pain inside her no longer belonged to her, and if she did not pass it to another, it would grow roots. She believed that silence could still be earned, that if she withered slowly enough, she might unmake herself. The final sentence began mid-thought. When he comes to find me, then nothing, just the line dragging off the page as if her hand had failed her one last time. By the time the authorities pieced together what had been done beneath the Whitlock house, the people of Cider Hollow had already begun forgetting, not out of innocence, but out of choice. The town had never truly been blind. There had been whispers, rumors muttered behind closed shutters. Fragments of unease passed between hands like crumpled notes no one wanted to keep. But nothing had ever been done because the sickness had dressed itself in white linen and clean hands, and because it had offered something useful in return. Horace Whitlock had given them medicine when no one else would ride through snowstorms to reach their sick children. He had delivered breech births in the dead of winter, pulled infections from their wounds, stitched their drunk sons back together after fights. He had saved lives, and when the questions got too close, he reminded them of those lives with gentle, perfect smiles. There had been signs. A boy went missing from the edge of town after claiming voices came from beneath the ground. A farmhand saw Miriam carrying buckets to the woods that steamed in the cold but left no smell of milk or water. One old woman swore she heard music late at night, not from any instrument she knew, but a sound like skin tightening across drums rising and falling in unnatural rhythm. The town called her senile. When a traveling priest tried to question Horace about the rumors of disappearances, he fell ill the next day. He never returned. They called it influenza, but no one else caught it. What held the town wasn't just fear, it was comfort. As long as Horace kept his horrors quiet, they were easy to ignore. The Whitlocks never asked for much. They didn't join church socials or town meetings. They existed on the periphery. A necessary strangeness that people had learned to walk around. Parents told their children not to ask questions. Shopkeepers stopped checking the back window when they heard the Whitlock cart pass in the night. And when the clinic doors closed for days at a time, no one knocked. They assumed rest, or perhaps they didn't want to find out what came after assumption. Now, with the investigation laid bare and the chambers beneath exposed, guilt spread through the town like mold, quiet but clinging. Neighbors admitted they'd known about strange deliveries, that the cellar lights were always on, that Miriam once came to the general store with blood on her sleeves and claimed it was from a pig she'd never bought. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen not to remember, and that was worse. In the official report, one line stood out above the rest. It came not from law enforcement or forensic experts, but from a retired schoolteacher who had lived 2 houses away from the Whitlocks. She said he didn't hide it well. We just never looked close enough. It was written in the final summary as a closing note, but it should have been the title, because evil had not worn a mask in Cider Hollow. It had simply smiled while everyone turned their backs. It took nearly 2 years for the full forensic picture to emerge, and even then, much of it was pieced together through implication, gaps, and the kind of horrors that left no clean answers. The bones came first, brittle, discolored, many with surgical notches along the ribs and spine. Then came the teeth, catalogued by jaw fragments nearly all removed from the mouth while the skull remained intact. The skulls themselves were buried shallow in concentric patterns behind the orchard, some facing inward, others facing skyward as if arranged with intention. Of the 38 confirmed victims, only 19 could be named. The rest had been stripped of their identities long before the ground took them. The list of the lost grew quickly. A boy from the county asylum transferred out in 1921 but never received. 2 sisters from a traveling faith group last seen accepting Horace's offer of rest after a long sermon. A farmhand who had suffered from violent seizures and was quietly dropped off by his employer, hoping for discretion. The names came from every edge of society: drifters, children, veterans, the mentally ill, the poor. They had no one to chase their absence, and even when someone tried, there was always a letter, a document, a polite explanation from Dr. Whitlock stating their transfer, their release, their unfortunate relapse. All forged, all sealed with the confidence of a man no one questioned. The national press seized on the story with a kind of breathless disbelief. The phrase "hospital beneath" began circulating in headlines, whispered on radio broadcasts, printed beside photos of the house's decayed facade. The public wanted to know how such atrocities could have gone unnoticed for so long. How a man could remove people from the world one by one in full view of a town that claimed to value faith, medicine, and decency. There were hearings, not just local but federal. A full Senate investigation was launched. The word Whitlock appeared on the floor of Congress, spoken with outrage by men who had never heard it before but now used it to justify sweeping reform. Medical licensing procedures were overhauled. Rural clinics faced new inspection mandates. Record-keeping laws were rewritten to prevent the loss of transfer documentation. The nation swore it would never allow such silence to grow roots again. But behind the speeches and the reforms, behind the forensic diagrams and classified transcripts, there was a truth that no one wanted printed. That what Horace had built had not been hidden in a labyrinth of complexity. It had been simple. Director, it had stood in a house at the end of a dirt road disguised as kindness, sealed behind a door no one tried to open. The floor plan of the Whitlock house now hangs in a sealed archive in Washington. Every stairwell, every chamber, every drain. Not as evidence, but as a reminder. Because what lay beneath was not just a crime scene. It was a blueprint. And the fear that lingered wasn't about what Horace had done. It was about who might study it next. The house was taken down piece by piece. No wrecking ball, no grand collapse. Just men in white suits moving with slow, deliberate care, as if the bones of the building still breathed. The wood had rotted too far for salvage. The foundation, stained black in places the sun had never reached, was ground down into dust. Beneath it all, the basement was filled with concrete. Not as punishment, but as containment. The town requested that nothing be built in its place. Not a home, not a bench, just grass. Something clean to cover what had once soaked in what was unspeakable. A memorial was placed at the edge of the lot. A gray stone no taller than a child, its inscription etched without names because so many had never been identified. It read, "In memory of those who were silenced. May their pain echo loud enough to prevent silence again." It became a point of discomfort rather than pride. Some avoided it entirely. Others stood before it only briefly, unsure what they were supposed to feel. The town council held one ceremony, a single wreath, and then the subject was closed. But the questions didn't fade. Across universities and medical panels, in classrooms and ethics conferences, a single question kept resurfacing like a bruise that wouldn't heal. How could no one know? How did a man build a torture chamber under his own clinic and operate it for nearly 2 decades in full view of a functioning town? Theories were offered: social complicity, rural deference to authority, the fog of grief after war and plague. But none of them fully answered it, because the truth was too simple. Horace hadn't screamed, he hadn't threatened, he hadn't hidden behind shadows or locked gates. He had smiled, he had healed, he had helped. Experts in psychological pathology dissected his case for years. They said his charm wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. He didn't wear a mask. He was the mask, a hollow man who had studied not just the anatomy of the body, but the anatomy of trust. He had known how to speak gently, how to grieve publicly, how to thank the baker for extra bread, how to dress grief in pressed cuffs and clean shoes. He wasn't a monster in the woods. He was the man who offered to walk you home. A professor at a Boston symposium on institutional evil said it best. We keep looking for evil that screams, but most of the time it whispers, it makes tea, it brings you medicine when you're sick. It says what you need to hear while building something beneath your feet that you'll never be allowed to see. And in the case of Horace Whitlock, it had done all of those things with such care, such detail, that even when bones were missing and names disappeared, the town had still chosen to believe the narrative that comforted them most. Even now, Horace's journals are studied in silence, not to praise, not to emulate, but because there is always someone who wants to understand the how. What disturbed many wasn't just the horror. It was the clarity of it, the precision, the way he never lost control, the way he convinced himself he was doing good even as he cut a child's voice from their throat. He wrote that suffering was the only true teacher. That pain was the oldest scripture. That silence once earned was the closest thing to holiness this world could offer. He didn't rage, he didn't rant. He took his time. He smiled through it all. And in doing so, he left behind something far worse than a trail of corpses. He left behind a question, one that never stops knocking at the door of every quiet town, every small practice, every face that smiles too quickly. What if it's happening again? And what if we still wouldn't see it? The house is gone, the cellar is filled, the floor plans sit behind museum glass. And still, the question echoes. Not from the victims who can no longer speak, not from the town which has gone quiet again, but from the spaces in between, the pauses, the gaps in record books, the missing signatures, the gloved hands that close doors too gently. Could it happen again? And if so, how would we know? We build systems around trust. We wear coats and titles like armor, doctor, pastor, teacher, officer. The roles are meant to comfort, to reassure us that the person standing before us has been tested, certified, watched. But those same labels also shelter the worst kind of mind, the one that doesn't lash out but leans in. The one that doesn't hide in shadows but walks the corridors of hospitals and schools and quiet towns, blending in so perfectly that even when the ground softens beneath our feet, we hesitate to dig. Horace Whitlock didn't scream. He didn't shake. He didn't isolate himself in madness or cover his walls in nonsense. He wrote clearly. He studied anatomy with discipline. He quoted scripture and practiced his posture. He was, by every definition, calm. That was what made him unstoppable. He believed in what he was doing, not with rage, with purpose, with faith. And every checkmark beside his name, every license, every act of charity, every carefully polished lie, made it easier for the world around him to say, he couldn't be one of those. But who are those really? Is it the ones who lose control or the ones who never did? Is it the broken man screaming on the street corner or the surgeon with steady hands and a locked door? The question has always been the same. How do we tell the difference between care and control, between kindness and containment? And what happens when the answer arrives too late, buried under cement, behind a false wall, written in a journal no one was meant to find? Since the discovery of the Whitlock basement, hundreds of rural hospitals and clinics have been audited, policies rewritten, oversight increased. Yet the fear persists, not because there are more monsters now, but because we've seen how long one can survive when they learn to smile with their eyes and speak gently while building their empire in silence. It is no longer enough to say, "That was a different time." The truth is, evil doesn't belong to history, it belongs to patience, to planning, to the ones who wait for comfort to blind the rest of us. What Horace did was not just murder. It wasn't even ritual. It was a philosophy crafted in flesh, preserved in silence, and in the wrong hands it still breathes. Somewhere someone is studying him, not in horror but in awe, asking how he got away with it, not why he did it but how he was never stopped. So we end with the same quiet question, the one no committee can answer, the one no law can protect us from completely. You've seen what was hidden. You've heard what he believed. You know how he smiled. What do you think? Could this happen again?